wind howled through the cracks in the ancient walls of Buckingham Palace, its icy fingers curling under the heavy drapes that hung in the grand hallway. The storm outside, fierce as it was, couldn't match the turmoil brewing within. A peculiar event had unfolded that very morning, a crime that left the most seasoned detectives in a state of confusion. The palace, steeped in centuries of history, had never witnessed anything like it. No alarms had been triggered, no violent commotion had been heard, yet the disappearance of a high-ranking member of the royal family had left the authorities scrambling for answers. And it wasn't just the disappearance that was troubling. It was the manner in which it happened. Lord Alexander Blackwood, a distant cousin to the Queen, had vanished without a trace. His quarters, once grand and meticulously ordered, were found in disarray as if a struggle had occurred. Yet there were no signs of forced entry. The only clue left behind was a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was sitting on the edge of his writing desk, open, but its contents were gone. Inside there was a single delicate white feather. It looked harmless, even whimsical, but its presence had confounded the entire investigation. A feather. How did it connect? And why was the only thing left? The police were stumped. The royal guards had been on constant watch. The palace staff had been questioned, but no one had seen or heard anything suspicious. No fingerprints, no footprints, and nothing to suggest foul play. Yet the sensation of unease lingered in the air. Something was amiss. It was then that I, Sherlock Holmes, was summoned. My arrival at the palace was met with a mixture of reverence and dread. The seriousness of the situation was evident in the faces of the officials who greeted me. My reputation preceded me, and there was a sense of desperation in the way they handed me the details of the case. "Mr. Holmes," the chief inspector said gravely, "we've searched high and low. There are no signs of forced entry, no suspects. But the disappearance of Lord Blackwood is beyond our understanding. We need your expertise." I took the papers from him without a word, my mind already analyzing the situation. As I glanced over the notes, I felt a certain tension in the air, a palpable discomfort that hinted at something far deeper than a mere disappearance. The room where Lord Blackwood had vanished was still sealed off, untouched since the discovery of his absence. The sight was disconcerting, the grandeur of the room now marred by the evidence of a struggle, yet it was clear that whoever had taken him, if anyone at all, had not been in a hurry. The disorder was calculated, deliberate even. I approached the writing desk slowly, my eyes scanning every detail. The wooden box with the feather inside remained in place. I lifted it carefully, inspecting the craftsmanship. It was old, possibly centuries old, yet it was well maintained. There was something strangely familiar about the design, but I couldn't place it immediately. "Have you questioned the servants?" I asked, turning to the inspector. "Of course, Mr. Holmes," he replied, a hint of frustration in his voice. "None have reported anything unusual. The only thing we've been able to establish is that Lord Blackwood was last seen late last night before he retired to his chambers." "And the feather?" I asked, gesturing to the delicate object. The inspector hesitated. "It's strange, isn't it? We've considered it to be a mere trinket, perhaps some kind of personal item, but it feels out of place, especially in a case like this." I set the box down on the desk, my mind racing. There was something about the feather that nagged at me, as though it were trying to convey a message, yet it was shrouded in ambiguity. It didn't belong to Blackwood, not in the traditional sense. And yet it was here, on his desk, in his personal space. "I'd like to speak with the staff who last saw Lord Blackwood," I said, turning to the inspector. "Perhaps there's something they've missed." Within the hour, the servants had been gathered in a nearby sitting room. Each face was a study in nervousness, their eyes darting back and forth as they recounted their interactions with the missing lord. No one had seen anything out of the ordinary, but there was a distinct unease among them. One of the maids, a young woman named Clara, spoke up hesitantly. I did notice something strange last night. Lord Blackwood. He seemed different. He was speaking to someone on the phone, but he looked agitated. I couldn't hear the conversation, but it wasn't his usual calm demeanor. And when he hung up, he seemed worried. "Worried?" I repeated. "What do you mean?" She fidgeted nervously. "It's hard to explain. It was as if he was afraid of something. I've never seen him like that before." This was the first lead that seemed to hold any weight. I thanked Clara and turned back to the inspector. "We need to find out who Blackwood was speaking to. That phone call may be the key." The palace phone records were retrieved, and after a few hours of meticulous examination, we found that Blackwood had indeed made a call late the previous night. The number, however, was unlisted. It belonged to a private line, one that was traced back to a small estate just outside London. I turned to the inspector. "We're going to visit this estate. There's more to this mystery than meets the eye." The storm raged on outside. I could feel the tension building. The feather, the strange phone call, the locked room. All the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. But there was still one question that lingered in my mind. Who would want to take Lord Blackwood, and why? The answer, I knew, would soon reveal itself. The drive to the estate was a quiet one, the wind whistling through the cracks of the old carriage as it jostled along the uneven road. The palace had been left behind, its towering walls a distant silhouette against the darkening sky. The estate we were heading toward was a modest affair, tucked away in a secluded corner of the countryside. It was not grand like Buckingham, but there was something about it, an air of hidden secrets that seemed to echo in the stillness of the trees surrounding it. The inspector sat beside me, his eyes narrowed with concentration. "Do you think this is where Lord Blackwood has been taken, Mr. Holmes?" "I believe it is the starting point," I replied, my voice calm. "The phone call, though mysterious, seems to be the only thread connecting us to his disappearance. We must follow it wherever it leads." As we approached the estate, I couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in the landscape. The trees were bare, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. There was an oppressive stillness that hung over the estate, as though it had been abandoned for years, even though the lights inside were clearly on. The inspector rang the doorbell, his knuckles tapping impatiently against the brass. Moments later, the door creaked open to reveal a tall, stern-looking man in his late 50s. His eyes were sharp, but there was something in his posture, an unnerving stiffness that suggested he wasn't pleased with our arrival. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice polite but curt. "I'm Inspector Hamilton, and this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the inspector began. "We're here to inquire about a phone call made by Lord Blackwood last night. We have reason to believe that the call was made to this residence." The man's face barely twitched. He didn't deny it, but he didn't confirm it either. Instead, he motioned for us to enter. "You're welcome to come in, but I must warn you, There is little to discuss. Lord Blackwood has been gone for some time, and I believe there has been a misunderstanding. His words were carefully chosen, as if he were measuring each one. I stepped inside, my gaze immediately drawn to the interior. The house was tastefully furnished, but there was a certain coldness to it, as if the place lacked warmth. The windows were shuttered, and the walls adorned with dark paintings that seemed to follow my every movement. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. We were led into a small sitting room, where the man who introduced himself as Mr. Robert Granger offered us tea. I declined. My eyes were already scanning the room, noting every detail. The fireplace was cold, the embers long since gone. The bookshelves were filled with leather-bound volumes, many of which appeared untouched. But what caught my attention was the single chair positioned near the window, a chair that seemed to have been recently moved. The rug beneath it was slightly askew, as though it had been hurriedly repositioned, a detail most would overlook, but one that stood out to me in the otherwise orderly room. I sat, but my mind was already working, piecing things together in a way that the inspector was not yet able to follow. Mr. Granger's stiff demeanour, his unwillingness to speak openly about Blackwood, these were signs of something more. He wasn't just being polite, he was hiding something. And it wasn't just his behaviour that raised suspicions. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, studying me, as if he were trying to assess how much I knew. "I understand your concern, gentlemen," Granger said, breaking the silence, "but I assure you I have no knowledge of Lord Blackwood's whereabouts. He came to visit me some time ago and we spoke. But he left after that, and I have not seen him since." "You mentioned a visit," I said, my voice low but firm. "When exactly did he leave?" Granger's eyes flickered just for a moment before he composed himself. "Several days ago." He seemed agitated, troubled even. But he insisted on leaving, and I let him go. That's all I know. "Did you notice anything unusual during his visit? Any particular behaviour, any unusual items?" I asked, my gaze locking with his. Granger shifted in his seat, his hands clasping tightly in his lap. "No, nothing of the sort. But there was something in his tone, something that didn't quite match the words. A flicker of hesitation, perhaps. A subtle shift in his posture that suggested he was holding back more than he let on. I could feel it. The faintest thread of deception. I stood up, abruptly startling both Granger and the inspector. "May I see the room where Blackwood stayed?" I asked, my voice sharp with purpose. Granger hesitated but nodded reluctantly. He led us down a narrow hallway to a small guest room at the back of the house. As we entered, I immediately took in the details. The room was sparsely furnished, nothing extravagant, but there was a sense of carefulness about it. The bed was unmade, and the small desk by the window was cluttered with papers. Yet it wasn't the disarray that caught my attention. It was a small, inconspicuous object resting on the desk. A matchbook. It was an odd thing to find in a room so meticulously kept. The matchbook was ordinary in every sense, except for the logo on the front. It was an emblem I recognized from my travels years ago, a symbol from a secretive, forgotten society known to deal in rare artifacts and obscure knowledge. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my fingers. The edges were worn, suggesting it had been opened more than once, but it was otherwise unremarkable. I turned to Granger, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable under my gaze. "Mr. Granger," I began, my voice low and steady, Do you have any idea what this might be, or what it could mean? His face paled slightly and he avoided my gaze, his eyes darting toward the floor. I don't know. It's nothing. But I knew better. The matchbook was a clue, one that linked this place to something far more intricate than it appeared. The feather, the phone call, Granger's strange reactions, and now this inconspicuous item, each piece was adding to the growing puzzle. I turned to the inspector, my mind already processing the connections. We need to dig deeper into Mr. Granger's past. I believe he's been hiding something, and I'm certain Lord Blackwood's disappearance is just the beginning. As I left the guest room and rejoined the inspector in the dimly lit hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were moving closer to the heart of something far more dangerous than I had anticipated. The matchbook, small and unassuming though it was, seemed to tie Granger's estate to a network I had not yet unraveled. But the contradictions were multiplying, each one a step closer to the truth. Granger's demeanor had become more strained, though he still insisted on his innocence. He had nothing to do with Blackwood's disappearance, nothing at all, he claimed. His words were becoming more defensive, but it wasn't the words themselves that caught my attention. It was the subtle shifts in his body language, the way his eyes darted when I pressed him about the matchbook, the way his posture stiffened when I mentioned the phone call. Something didn't fit, and as I looked at the inspector, I could tell he was beginning to sense it too. "We'll need to revisit the palace," I said, my mind already shifting toward the next phase of the investigation. "There are discrepancies in the testimonies we've heard. We need to speak with more people. Anyone who might have seen or heard something the night Lord Blackwood disappeared." The inspector nodded grimly, though I could see the unease in his eyes. "But Holmes, what if Granger is telling the truth? What if we're missing something?" I paused, considering his words for a moment before replying. "If he is telling the truth, then why did he seem so uncomfortable when we found that matchbook? And why, when I asked him about Blackwood's visit, did he hesitate just long enough to make me doubt him? No, Inspector, there's something deeper at play here. Something Granger isn't willing to share." We returned to the palace just as the evening light began to fade, the grand structure looming above us like a silent sentinel. The staff was still on edge, but they seemed to relax slightly at the sight of the inspector's familiar presence. We immediately set to work questioning the remaining servants who had been on duty the night of Blackwood's disappearance. It was a slow and methodical process, but I could feel the pieces of the puzzle slowly aligning. The first witness was an elderly footman named Mr. Harris. He had worked at the palace for decades and seemed eager to help, though his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "Lord Blackwood," he said, wrinkling his brow. "Yes, I remember him well. He was a regular guest, you know, though not often seen in the company of others. Quite a solitary man, really. But that night, well, I didn't see him leave. No, he didn't pass through the servants' quarters or the main halls, not while I was on duty." "But you heard nothing unusual?" I asked, leaning forward. "No sounds of struggle? No voices raised in anger?" Mr. Harris hesitated, his eyes flickering to the floor. "No, nothing like that. But there was something odd. Just before midnight I saw the shadow of someone near the entrance hall. It didn't quite match Lord Blackwood's height. It could have been anyone. But it's hard to say, what with the shadows playing tricks." A vague answer, but not unexpected. His reluctance to provide more was telling. I nodded, offering him a small smile of reassurance. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. We may need to speak with you again." As he left, I turned to the inspector. He's hiding something. He didn't see anything, but he knows more than he's letting on. Next, we spoke with the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Turner, whose composure was far more steely than the others. She didn't seem nervous, but her answers were clipped, almost rehearsed. "I was the last to see Lord Blackwood that night," she said, her voice even. "He appeared to be in good health, though somewhat distracted. I offered to bring him his dinner, but he declined. He seemed preoccupied." "What was he preoccupied with?" I asked, my gaze steady. Mrs. Turner's eyes flickered momentarily, but she quickly recovered. "He was reading something, some papers or correspondence, I believe. He asked for complete silence. I left him to his work, and that was the last I saw of him." "And you didn't hear anything unusual?" I pressed. "No sounds of struggle, no disturbances?" "Nothing at all," she replied quickly, almost too quickly. The palace was silent, as it always is at that hour. Her calmness unsettled me. There was a tightness in her responses, a sense that she was too eager to cooperate, too eager to clear herself of any suspicion. That eagerness felt like a smokescreen, hiding something darker beneath it. I made a note to revisit her later. Our questioning continued, with each servant offering a similar tale. Nothing out of the ordinary, no sounds of a struggle, no sign of anything amiss. But there was something in their collective stories that didn't add up. No one had heard anything unusual, yet the sense of unease that permeated the palace suggested otherwise. It wasn't until we spoke with Clara, the young maid who had been the first to mention Blackwood's odd behavior the night before his disappearance, that things began to take a sharper focus. Clara had been sent to tidy up Blackwood's chambers earlier that morning, and she had been the one to discover the room's disarray. But when I spoke with her this time, I noticed something in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that had been absent before. "Clara, you mentioned that Lord Blackwood had been agitated the night before he disappeared. Was there anything else you noticed? Anything unusual?" Clara hesitated, wringing her hands nervously. I saw him leave the room for a moment. He didn't see me, but I saw him through the crack in the door. He was talking to someone, but I couldn't make out who. It wasn't anyone I recognized." "Who was he talking to?" I asked, my voice steady but insistent. Clara's gaze dropped to the floor. I don't know. I didn't hear their voices clearly, but it sounded like a woman. A strange voice, not like anyone else in the palace. And then, after a moment, he just left. He looked like he was in a hurry. He didn't even glance back. The shift in her story was subtle, but it was there. A woman? It was a new lead, one that no one else had mentioned. I turned to the inspector. "We need to find out who that woman was. It's likely that Blackwood's disappearance is tied to her, and she may have played a far more significant role in this than anyone has realized." Clara's words echoed in my mind as I left the palace later that evening. Each new contradiction, each nervous glance, was pulling the investigation deeper into a web of deceit. Granger's estate, the matchbook, the servants' varying stories, it was all beginning to connect. But there was one piece missing, and I was determined to find it. The woman who had spoken to Blackwood, the one who had been present when he disappeared, she was the key. And finding her would reveal the truth. The following days were a blur of careful observation and calculated inquiry, each step forward only revealing further layers to the mystery. I sat at my desk late into the night, surrounded by scraps of paper, notes, and the growing puzzle of motives that seemed to entwine the suspects in this case. The more I dug into the lives of those connected to Lord Blackwood, their pasts, their relationships, their possible motives, the more tangled the web became. Each person, it seemed, had something to hide. The first thread I pulled was Granger. I had already sensed that he was hiding something, but now I needed to understand what it was. The matchbook he had so carelessly left in Blackwood's guest room was no mere trinket. It was a link to an old society, one that had long since faded from public knowledge. The emblem on it, the twisted serpent encircling a skull, was a symbol I recognized from my days in Eastern Europe, a clandestine group known for dealing in rare artifacts and forbidden knowledge. Lord Blackwood's involvement with them, if it was true, was a matter of great interest. But why would Granger, a man of seemingly modest means, have connections to such a shadowy organization? What had Lord Blackwood stumbled upon during his visit that had led to his disappearance? I turned to the inspector. We need to speak with Blackwood's acquaintances outside of this circle, his business associates, his lawyers. Someone might have known more about his dealings, especially in recent weeks. Inspector Hamilton seemed troubled, though he nodded in agreement. I've already spoken with his lawyer. They confirmed that Blackwood had been seeking to liquidate several of his more valuable assets. But nothing about his personal life was discussed. Nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, I said, narrowing my eyes, there is something very extraordinary about this case. Blackwood was involved with something, or someone, that we have not yet accounted for. Greed alone cannot explain this. There's more to it. We arranged to meet with several of Blackwood's contacts, though I suspected none of them would tell us the whole truth. I began with the man I believed had the most to lose from Blackwood's disappearance, an old business rival named Richard Shaw. A wealthy gentleman with a reputation for being both charming and ruthless, Shaw had much to gain from Blackwood's absence. His empire in the art world was vast, and a sizable portion of it had come at the expense of Blackwood's investments. Could Shaw have had a reason to take matters into his own hands? When I arrived at Shaw's estate, I was greeted by an air of controlled calm. Shaw was dressed in a dark suit, his face neatly shaved, his eyes calculating. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Hamilton," Shaw said, his voice smooth, bordering on too polished. "I understand you're investigating the disappearance of Lord Blackwood. Quite a tragedy, I must say." "Indeed," I replied, my gaze assessing him with each word he spoke. "I wonder, Mr. Shaw, how long you've known Lord Blackwood." "Years," Shaw replied without hesitation. "We've done business together for nearly a decade, though, I must admit, he wasn't a man I ever entirely trusted." "Why is that?" I asked, leaning forward slightly, watching for any sign of hesitation. Shaw's lips curled into a slight smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "Blackwood was a difficult man, Mr. Holmes. Ambitious, yes, but he played the game in ways that made others uneasy. He wanted to push boundaries, take risks that others deemed unwise. And, as I'm sure you know, those who risk everything are often left with nothing. And yet," I pressed, "you've continued to work with him for years." Shaw's gaze shifted for just a moment, his eyes flicking to the side. "A necessity. There were deals to be made, Mr. Holmes. You don't let personal feelings interfere with business." I studied him carefully, noting the careful way he measured each word. His reasons for Blackwood's disappearance seemed almost too rehearsed, too neat. I didn't trust him, but I had no concrete proof to tie him directly to Blackwood's vanishing. "Do you have any knowledge of Lord Blackwood's recent actions? Any unusual behaviour?" I asked. Shaw's smile faded, and he looked momentarily uncomfortable. "I haven't had contact with him in weeks, though I did hear rumours, whispers, that he had been involved in some dealings with a very peculiar individual. Someone who might have a vested interest in his absence." I raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Shaw shook his head. "I'm afraid I don't. No, Mr. Holmes. But you might want to ask around. The art world can be a treacherous place." The conversation had yielded little, but it was enough to suggest that Shaw, while possibly involved in shady dealings, was not the key to the mystery. His motives were clear: business rivalry, greed, and perhaps some jealousy, but he hadn't directly gained from Blackwood's disappearance. There was another piece to this puzzle, and it wasn't in Shaw's hands. My thoughts returned to Mrs. Turner, the housekeeper, and Clara, the maid. They, too, were integral parts of the puzzle. Their alibis seemed too neat, too carefully crafted. Mrs. Turner had been overly eager to cooperate, perhaps because she was trying to cover up something that had happened in the shadows of the palace. And Clara, her mention of a mysterious woman talking to Blackwood added a wrinkle to the case that hadn't yet been addressed. Was she involved, or had she witnessed something more significant than she realized? I decided it was time to speak with them again, but this time I would approach them differently. I would challenge them, not with force but with precision. Their lies, if they had any, would begin to unravel. When I arrived back at the palace, I found Clara cleaning the hallway, her movements quick but careful. As soon as she saw me, her posture stiffened, but I didn't give her a chance to retreat. "Clara," I said, walking toward her, "tell me everything you saw that night, every detail, no matter how small." Her hands paused, the rag in her hand trembling slightly. "I already told you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I didn't see much." "You mentioned a woman," I pressed, my voice steady. "Who was she?" Clara's face went pale, and she took a step back. "I don't know who she was, but I heard her voice. It wasn't a palace voice. It was strange, unfamiliar. She was telling him to leave. And then he left." "Why did you wait to tell me this?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "Why not mention it earlier?" She bit her lip, clearly torn. "I was afraid. I didn't know if it was important, but now, Mr. Holmes, now I'm sure it is." I could see the fear in her eyes, the cracks in her composure. Something had happened that night, a meeting, an exchange, that neither she nor the others were willing to fully admit. As I left Clara and made my way to the staff quarters to find Mrs. Turner, I couldn't shake the sense that I was close to uncovering the real motive behind Blackwood's disappearance. Every new piece of information led me in a different direction, but none of the suspects were clear of guilt. Was it money? Revenge? Something else? No one could be ruled out yet. There was still more to uncover, and I would keep digging until the truth came to light, no matter how deep it was buried. The next morning, as the sunlight streamed through the tall windows of my office, I received an unexpected visit. Inspector Hamilton was already waiting, a piece of paper clutched tightly in his hand, his face a mixture of triumph and doubt. "Holmes," he said, his voice tinged with both excitement and hesitation. "We've found something. I think we've finally got it." I motioned for him to sit, my mind already racing. "What is it?" He unfolded the paper and placed it in front of me. It was a letter, hastily written, clearly not meant for public consumption. The handwriting was familiar, but the contents were far more revealing than I had anticipated. "It's from Mrs. Turner," Hamilton said, his eyes scanning the paper. She was apparently trying to cover her tracks, but she slipped. "This letter, sent to someone named C. Moore, details Blackwood's involvement in some questionable business ventures. He'd been planning to expose them, to ruin some very important people. The letter implies that Turner herself knew about this and might have helped cover up the truth." I leaned in, studying the letter with intensity. It described a secret meeting between Blackwood and an unnamed associate, a discussion about financial dealings that had gone wrong. Turner's words in the letter suggested that Blackwood had made enemies, powerful ones who had no interest in letting their secrets spill into the public. "Could this be the breakthrough we needed?" Hamilton asked, his voice eager. "It certainly gives Turner a motive. Maybe she was afraid Blackwood was going to ruin her life, expose her ties to these dangerous people." I sat back, considering the implications. On the surface, it seemed like a perfect resolution. Mrs. Turner, the ever-observant housekeeper, had been hiding her own secrets, perhaps even working with forces outside the palace to protect her own interests. She had the motive, the opportunity, and now the evidence that linked her directly to Blackwood's disappearance. But something didn't sit right with me. It was too convenient. Turner had been overly helpful from the beginning, too eager to provide answers that kept her out of suspicion. She had a motive, yes, but would she really have been careless enough to leave a letter like this lying around? No, I suspected there was more to the story. "Inspector, I'm not convinced," I said slowly, pushing the letter away. "This letter may point to Mrs. Turner, but we cannot assume she is the mastermind just yet. We need to look deeper. This feels like a false victory." Hamilton looked at me, his brow furrowing. "But the evidence is too tidy," I interrupted, my mind already working through the possible scenarios. "We have a letter that conveniently explains her motives and connections, but that doesn't sit with what I've seen. The motives are there, yes. But where is the action? Where is the real link between her and Blackwood's disappearance? If she's involved, she's too clever to leave such an obvious trail." I stood, pacing back and forth in the small office, turning the situation over in my mind. Mrs. Turner might have known about Blackwood's dealings, but had she orchestrated his disappearance? I didn't believe it. Someone else was still pulling the strings. There was another clue I hadn't yet addressed. The woman Clara had mentioned. The mysterious voice, the one Blackwood had spoken to just before he left the palace. No one had yet been able to identify her, but I had my suspicions. She was the missing link, the one who would connect all the pieces together. "Inspector," I said, stopping mid-step, "we need to go back to the palace. There is something more we've overlooked. We've focused too much on Turner. She's hiding something, yes, but I think she's been set up." Hamilton seemed uncertain, but I could see his resolve hardening. "You think someone else is behind this?" "Exactly," I replied, my mind sharpening. "I think Mrs. Turner is a pawn in a much bigger game. Someone used her fear to manipulate the situation. We need to find out who this woman is. C. Moore, the person Turner wrote to. That's where we'll find our answer." Hamilton hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'll gather the men. We'll go to the palace at once." When we arrived at the palace, it was eerily quiet. The grand halls, which had once seemed so full of life, now felt hollow and devoid of meaning. The servants were still on edge, though. Their eyes seemed to follow us with increasing suspicion. We moved swiftly through the corridors, making our way to Mrs. Turner's office. She was not there, but her papers, disorganized as though they had been recently rifled through, told a story of their own. As I sifted through the documents, I found several letters, some from Lord Blackwood himself, others from various individuals, all signed with the same cryptic initials, Seymour. Whoever this person was, they seemed to be a constant presence in Blackwood's life, even though I had never heard the name before. I carefully studied the correspondence. It became clear that Blackwood had been involved in something far more dangerous than I had initially realized, an underground operation that linked back to wealthy patrons with shady interests, including members of the royal court. The deeper I delved into the letters, the clearer it became that Blackwood was no mere victim. He had been playing a dangerous game, one that might have cost him everything. "What is it, Holmes?" Hamilton asked, his voice low. "What have you found?" I turned, my face grim. "The woman, Seymour. She's not just a name. She's someone in the palace, someone who's been using Turner to cover her tracks." I glanced at the clock. It was growing late, but I knew we couldn't wait. We needed to find Seymour, and fast. With each passing minute, the truth seemed to slip further away, as though the case was slipping through my fingers like sand. Mrs. Turner's letter had given us a glimpse of the truth, but it had also clouded our vision. This was no simple case of a housekeeper gone rogue. We left the office, heading straight for the main hall, where we were met by a familiar face, Clara. She was waiting near the doors, as if expecting us. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling. "There's someone you need to see. She's here, Seymour. She's been hiding in the palace, and she's been waiting for you." My heart quickened. This was it. The person we had been chasing, the one whose name had surfaced time and again, was finally within reach. Clara led us to a small, dimly lit study at the far end of the palace. There, standing by the window, was a woman I had not expected, Mrs. Turner. But she was no longer the meek, compliant housekeeper. Her eyes burned with a mix of fear and defiance. "You were right," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But it's too late now. She's already made her move." Before I could ask further questions, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was not the woman I had expected. Instead, it was a man, a tall, imposing figure whose face I instantly recognized. It was Richard Shaw. And with that, everything I thought I knew about the case shattered. The false victory was over. The real game was just beginning. The figure that emerged from the shadows was a stark contrast to the sharp lines of suspicion I had crafted in my mind. Richard Shaw, the very man I had dismissed as a mere business rival, a player in a familiar game of greed and competition. But here he was, standing in the heart of this puzzle, a hidden force in the web that had grown increasingly tangled by the hour. His presence here was no coincidence. I froze for a moment, my mind racing to make sense of this new development. Shaw stepped forward, his expression one of quiet triumph, but his eyes betrayed a certain unease. He had not expected me to uncover his involvement, and he certainly hadn't expected to be caught here in the company of Mrs. Turner and Clara. "So you've finally put the pieces together, Holmes," Shaw said, his voice smooth, but with an edge I hadn't heard before. "I must admit, I thought we had more time before your keen eye uncovered everything. But now that you've seen—" "Enough! What will you do?" "Your game is up, Shaw," I said, my voice steady, though my mind continued to race. "But I'm still not convinced you're the one pulling the strings. What is it you've really been hiding?" Shaw's lips curled into a thin smile. "You think I'm the mastermind behind this? I'm merely a player in a much larger game. Holmes, Blackwood was involved in something far beyond the scope of this palace, far beyond even our world of art and wealth. You've only scratched the surface." I studied him carefully, his confidence masking the small tremor in his hands, the faintest nervousness that he tried hard to conceal. Whatever he was hiding, it was no longer about the simple matter of business rivalries. There was something darker at play. "You've been playing both sides, Shaw," I said, my voice colder now. "You've been collaborating with forces far more dangerous than I initially realized. But why involve Mrs. Turner? Why her?" Shaw's gaze flickered toward the housekeeper, but it was clear he had underestimated her. She looked less like the obedient servant I had once believed her to be, and more like a woman caught in a web of her own making. She avoided my gaze, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "You didn't expect her to be caught, did you?" I continued, my words deliberate. "She's part of this, but you've been using her fear as leverage. You needed someone to keep the palace in line while you moved your pieces around. You used her fear of exposure to keep her compliant." Mrs. Turner's eyes widened, but before she could respond, Shaw stepped in front of her. "Enough, Holmes," he said, his voice low. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. You're right about one thing. We've all been hiding something. But there's one truth you've overlooked. This crime, this whole series of events, is not about money, not about power. It's about the past. And you—" Shaw's eyes narrowed as he pointed a finger toward me, "are standing in the middle of it." I took a step back, intrigued despite myself. The past. That word echoed in my mind like a distant warning bell, something I had been brushing aside as irrelevant in the rush of the present case. But now Shaw's cryptic remark stirred something within me. The investigation had always seemed to involve new rivalries, new motives. But what if it was something older, something buried long ago, that was influencing everything now? "Past?" I asked, voice measured, but with a sense of urgency. "Explain yourself, Shaw. What are you talking about?" He shook his head, his face darkening. "You think this is just a matter of current business dealings and art world politics? You think Blackwood's disappearance is just a case of greed and rivalry? No, Holmes. This is about a secret that's been hidden for over a decade. One that links me, Turner, and Blackwood together. One that goes back to something we were all involved in." I glanced at Mrs. Turner, whose face had gone pale, and then at Clara, who stood in the background, her hands clenched into tight fists. Whatever Shaw was about to reveal, it was something none of them were eager to discuss. "The three of us," Shaw continued, his voice lowering, "were once involved in a scheme, a long-forgotten operation that no one dared to speak of. Blackwood, Turner, and I, we all played a role, but we weren't the only ones. There was another, Seymour. You've heard that name before, haven't you?" I nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. Seymour had been the thread running through everything. The cryptic letters, the strange conversations, the inexplicable connections. But who was Moore really? Why had this name haunted the case like a shadow? The four of us were involved in an operation years ago, Holmes. Shaw continued, his eyes now dark with the weight of unspoken history. We were all part of a covert group that worked under the radar, investigating and acquiring ancient artifacts, things no one was supposed to find, things that were dangerous, things that were better left buried. But that was before it all went wrong. The room grew colder as Shaw spoke, and I could feel the weight of his words sinking in. The case I had been so sure of, the lines I had drawn between suspect and motive, now seemed meaningless in comparison. What had once been a simple mystery of disappearance had now turned into something far more dangerous, something connected to a forgotten past and people I had once trusted. Blackwood discovered something, didn't he? I asked, piecing it together. Something connected to the artifacts, something buried that he should never have found. Shaw nodded grimly. Yes. He uncovered information about a relic, one we thought had been lost. A relic that, if discovered by the wrong people, would change everything. We had to keep it hidden, and when Blackwood threatened to reveal it, we knew we had to stop him. I took a deep breath. This was no longer just a missing person case. This was about something much more profound, something buried beneath layers of deception, lies, and fear. Lord Blackwood's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a chain of events set in motion long before any of us had come onto the scene. "And Turner?" I asked, turning to the housekeeper, who was now trembling with a mixture of fear and resignation. "How does she fit into this?" Shaw's gaze softened just for a moment. Turner was the only one who knew where Blackwood had hidden the final piece of the puzzle. She was part of the original plan, but she's terrified of what might happen if the truth comes out. She's been protecting herself, Holmes, and I can't blame her. "But you betrayed her," I said, feeling the weight of her role in all of this. "You used her, manipulated her fear, just as you used Blackwood." Shaw's eyes flickered with something like regret, but it was gone before I could decipher. Everyone has their own demons, Holmes. I never meant for it to go this far. But when Blackwood started making threats, when he realized what we were involved in, there was no turning back. I felt a cold sense of dread creeping into my bones. There was a relic, something ancient, something powerful, and Blackwood had discovered its location. Whatever it was far more dangerous than any of us had imagined. I looked around the room, my mind racing. The truth was beginning to surface, but there were still so many unknowns. Where was this relic? What was it, and who else was after it? The shadows of the past had risen, and with them came a truth far darker than I had ever anticipated. The case was far from over. It had only just begun. The conversation with Shaw had brought me no closer to the truth. If anything, it had deepened the mystery. The relic, the hidden past, and the people involved were like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. But one thing was clear. The case was not simply about Blackwood's disappearance anymore. It was about a power struggle rooted in ancient secrets, and those who had played their parts in this dark history had become prisoners of their own deceit. As Shaw continued to speak, I began to focus on something else, the reactions of the people in the room. Mrs. Turner's hands were still trembling, but I noticed a strange tension in her eyes, a tension that wasn't born from fear alone. It was something else, something more deliberate, Clara, too, had been unusually silent, her posture stiff and her gaze fixed on shore. She was clearly on edge, but there was something more than just fear in her demeanor. It was almost as if she was holding something back, something important. Stood, deciding it was time to test the waters, to force their hands in a way they hadn't anticipated. I had learned long ago that people could only conceal their true feelings for so long. Sometimes all it took was a single, well-timed question or action to crack their facade. Without a word, I stepped closer to Mrs. Turner, my eyes locked on hers. She flinched at my proximity, her body instinctively pulling away, but she quickly regained her composure. It was an act, of course, a calculated move on her part, designed to hide the growing unease beneath her surface. I had seen it before, the way people tried to control their fear by distancing themselves physically, but I had learned long ago that fear often revealed more than anger or resolve. "I know you're hiding something, Mrs. Turner," I said, my voice low and even. "Something more than you've let on. I'm sure of it. You've been manipulating the truth from the start, and now you're trying to cover your tracks, but the cracks are starting to show." She stiffened, her mouth pressing into a thin line. Her eyes flickered momentarily to shore, and in that brief glance I saw it. A fleeting moment of recognition, an acknowledgement of the game she had been playing, but it was too late to turn back. She was trapped in the web of her own lies. Turned toward Clara, and this time I didn't wait for her to speak. "And you, Clara," I said, locking my gaze onto her. "You've been quiet for far too long. You know more than you're letting on. You've been keeping something from me, something that ties you all together." Clara blinked, but she didn't break eye contact. Her posture remained rigid, her hands still clenched at her sides. The air between us grew tense, thick with anticipation. I knew that I had struck a nerve, but I also knew she would not crack easily. She was too composed, too calculating. "What are you trying to hide, Clara?" I pressed. "Is it the relic or something else? You've been part of this from the start, haven't you? You knew about the secret, the artifact. But why stay silent when you could have exposed the truth?" Her lips parted as if she was about to speak, but no words came out. It was a slight hesitation, just enough to show that my words had struck home. It was then that I realized my misstep. I had expected her to crumble under the pressure, but instead, her face hardened, her eyes growing colder. She wasn't just hiding information, she was concealing something deeper, something more personal. It was in that moment that I realized how deeply this web of deception ran. These people were not simply motivated by greed or fear. They were protecting something much more significant. They were not merely playing a game. They were safeguarding their very identities. Each one of them, in their own way, was linked by this hidden past, a past they all feared would come to light. I needed a way to break them, to force them to reveal the truth. A simple interrogation wouldn't suffice. I had to get inside their heads, to make them feel like they were in control, even as I closed in on them. It was then that I remembered an old technique I had once employed during a case in Paris, a psychological trick that had worked on even the most stubborn of criminals. It wasn't about direct confrontation or simple questions. No, it was about manipulation, about testing their reactions in subtle ways that would reveal their true nature. I turned back to Shaw, my expression neutral. "You know, Shaw, you're right about one thing," I said, my voice calm and almost contemplative. "You've all been involved in something far more dangerous than I initially realized. But I can't help but wonder, If you've been hiding something this big, if all of you have been so deeply entangled in this operation, what else are you capable of? Shaw's eyes narrowed. He shifted, his posture slightly defensive, and his mouth tightened. I had seen it before. He was on the verge of a reaction, of something that would betray him. It was the same with Turner, too. Her breath had quickened imperceptibly. And Clara? She shifted her weight, her eyes darting around the room, as though searching for an escape. I knew that these small movements, these subtle signs, were all I needed to exploit. They were vulnerable, all of them, under the surface. And that was when I made my move. I've thought about it a great deal, you know, I continued, my voice cool, but with a hint of something unsettling. All the players involved in this case, all the people who've been hiding their true motives, there's only one way to bring it all to light, isn't there? Someone needs to take the fall. Someone needs to be sacrificed to protect the rest. I paused for effect, letting the silence fill the room. The tension grew thick. Shaw's hand clenched into a fist. Turner's fingers twitched, as though she were considering whether to speak up. Clara's face had gone pale, her lips slightly parted as though she had just caught a glimpse of something she hadn't fully understood until now. And then it happened. Shaw's facade cracked. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and his face twisted in a mixture of frustration and anger. "You can't do this," he snapped, his voice suddenly raw. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Holmes. You can't understand the consequences of what we've done." It was the first crack I had seen in his carefully constructed armor, the first sign of fear slipping through. He wasn't just angry, he was desperate. And that desperation, that vulnerability, was the key I had been searching for. "I understand perfectly," I said softly, watching him closely. "But what I don't understand is why you're so afraid of what's already been done. What's more important to you, Shaw, your own skin, or the relic you've been hiding all these years?" His eyes widened for just a fraction of a second, and in that fleeting moment I knew I had hit the nerve I was after. He had revealed it without meaning to. The relic was everything. It was the key to his actions, the one thing he would do anything to protect. I had my answer. But the rest of the puzzle was still in pieces, and Shaw's crack was just the beginning. The game had only grown more dangerous, and I was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The tension in the room lingered as Shaw's outburst echoed in my ears. His eyes were wild now. His facade cracked completely, exposing a man far more fearful than I had imagined. Yet even as his desperation flared, there was something off. Something in the way he clung to his self-control that made me suspect he was still hiding more than he let on. I took a step closer to him, my gaze never wavering. "You're hiding something, Shaw, and it's not just the relic, is it? There's more at play here, something much bigger, and it's not just about your personal survival. What are you really protecting?" Before he could respond, a sudden, sharp knock at the door broke the tense silence. It was Clara, her face pale, but her eyes colder than I had seen before. "I need to speak with you, Mr. Holmes. It's urgent." Without waiting for a reply, she entered, the air growing heavier with her presence. Shaw turned toward her, his jaw clenched. "What is it, Clara?" he demanded, his voice thick with both anger and anxiety. But she ignored him, her eyes fixed solely on me. "There's been a problem," Clara said, her voice steady but with an underlying tremor. "The evidence, it's gone." A chill ran through me, and for a split second I was sure I hadn't heard her correctly. "What do you mean, gone?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. I was already moving toward the desk, my mind racing. What evidence? Which piece had vanished? "The ledger," Clara answered, her lips trembling slightly as she spoke. "The one you asked me to examine. It's gone. Vanished from the safe, and no one knows how. We've looked everywhere, Mr. Holmes. It's as if it never existed." My thoughts stilled. The ledger, the one that had outlined the mysterious transactions between Shaw and the various players involved, was the key. It contained details I had believed would seal the case, evidence tying the players in the web to Blackwood's disappearance. Without it, my entire investigation would collapse. I turned sharply to Shaw. His face was a mask of confusion, but I could see the faintest tremor in his hands. "Where is it, Shaw?" I demanded. "What have you done with it?" Shaw's response was defensive, his voice rising in frustration. "I haven't touched it. I swear it wasn't me." He stepped back, as though to distance himself from the accusation, his eyes darting nervously to Clara. "This is absurd. The ledger was locked away." Clara shook her head. "I saw it earlier today, Mr. Holmes. I swear to you, it was right there." "In the safe. But now it's simply gone." She bit her lip, her eyes flicking back to Shaw. "We need to find it." I stood motionless, my mind racing. I knew the stakes were higher than ever. The theft of the ledger wasn't just a setback. It was a deliberate attempt to obstruct the investigation, to bury the truth before it could come to light. And the timing of it could not have been more telling. Someone was clearly working against me. I turned back to Shaw, my voice cold. "Someone in this room is hiding something, and I need answers. You both knew about that ledger, and now it's missing. Who else could have taken it, if not you?" Clara shifted uncomfortably, her eyes now locked on the floor, avoiding both mine and Shaw's gaze. Shaw, on the other hand, seemed to be unraveling before my eyes. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his gaze flickering between Clara and me, his breathing quickening. His lips parted, but nothing came out. "You're lying," I said, taking another step toward him. "I don't know why or how, but I know you're involved. Who would benefit from the ledger disappearing? Who gains the most from silencing the truth?" Clara's voice cut through the tension. "You're wrong, Mr. Holmes. Shaw didn't—" But before she could finish, a loud crash echoed through the hallway outside the room. The sound of footsteps, hurriedly retreating, reached our ears, and all of us froze. Someone else was in the building. Someone was trying to interfere. I turned toward the door, instincts kicking in. "Stay here," I ordered sharply, stepping out into the hall. Clara and Shaw remained behind, silent for a moment, as I moved quickly toward the source of the noise. The corridor was dimly lit, with long shadows stretching across the walls. I could hear a faint shuffling sound, the faintest echo of footsteps in the distance. It didn't take long for me to find the source. A dark figure moving swiftly through the shadows, the unmistakable shape of a man whose presence had been concealed. With calculated ease, I reached into my coat pocket for my revolver, fingers cold against the polished metal. Whoever this was, they had no intention of being caught. I rounded the corner, and the figure turned, locking eyes with me for just a moment before bolting toward the exit. Without hesitation, I gave chase, the sound of my footsteps ringing in the narrow corridor. The thief was fast, but I had the advantage of knowing the layout of the building, and I quickly closed the distance between us. As I rounded another corner, I saw him slip through the back door. It was the perfect escape route, and he was almost free. I took a deep breath and sprinted, pushing myself harder. The door slammed open just as I reached it, but before I could get there, the figure vanished into the night. I cursed under my breath, the anger swelling in my chest. This wasn't just about stolen evidence anymore. It was about sabotage. Someone wanted me to fail, to make sure I never uncovered the truth. I walked back to the room where Clara and Shaw waited, my mind racing. They were both still where I had left them, standing in tense silence, waiting for my return. Shaw's face was pale, his hands shaking slightly, while Clara looked more composed, though I could sense her unease. "The evidence is gone," I said, not bothering to soften the blow. "Someone tried to take it. Whoever's behind this is playing for keeps." Clara swallowed, her eyes flicking to Shaw. "But whoever wants the truth buried," I interrupted, narrowing my gaze. "And I think we both know who stands to lose the most if that ledger is found." I could see it in their eyes now, the fear. The realization had set in. One of them was lying. But which one? Both were guilty, yet one had orchestrated the theft, and I had no doubt that the stolen ledger held the key to unraveling this entire plot. The deeper I delved into this case, the more I saw the shadows looming over every corner, each lie a layer of darkness that seemed to stretch back into the past. The stakes had never been higher, and now trust had become as fragile as glass. Stared at Shaw and Clara, both of them now holding their breath, as the weight of the stolen ledger settled in the room like a tangible fog. But just as the tension reached its peak, the air shifted once more, a cold, sharp edge cutting through the silence. A distant scream echoed through the hall, sharp and unmistakable. It was a woman's cry, full of pain and desperation. Without thinking, I turned and rushed toward the sound, my pulse quickening with a new urgency. Clara's face paled, and Shaw seemed to recoil, as if expecting something terrible. But neither of them moved. Only I seemed to know the full gravity of the situation. Someone was in immediate danger. I barreled down the hall toward the source, my mind racing. The scream had come from the direction of the study, but as I neared the door, the scene that greeted me was nothing like I expected. The study was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a single candle that flickered near the corner. But the room itself was eerily still. The woman was nowhere to be seen. I scanned the room quickly, looking for any sign of struggle or movement. Then I noticed it. The scent. A faint but pungent smell of something burning, a mix of wood and something metallic. My instincts screamed at me that something was wrong, but I couldn't place it. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the far side of the room, and I froze, every muscle tensing. I knew this game well. Someone was still here, hidden in plain sight. I drew my revolver and moved cautiously toward the corner, the sound of my footsteps muffled against the floorboards. As I rounded the edge of a cabinet, I found the source of the disturbance. Clara. She was standing motionless by the desk, her hands trembling as they gripped the back of a chair. At her feet lay the body of a man, his face turned away from me but unmistakably lifeless. His clothes were scorched, his skin burned and blistered in places, and the unmistakable evidence of a violent struggle was evident in the disarray around him. I felt my chest tighten. The second murder. But how? Why? And why her? "Clara," I called. my voice sharp but controlled. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide with panic, but she didn't respond. Her lips quivered as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. I stepped forward cautiously, keeping my weapon trained on the body. "Who is he?" I asked, though I had a sinking suspicion I knew the answer. Her response came out in a choked whisper. It's Felix Blackwood." I felt the floor shift beneath me, and the cold realization hit me like a slap to the face. Blackwood was supposed to be missing, presumed dead, but here he was, his body lying in front of me. And the manner of his death, burned alive, a grotesque display of violence, was a clear message. "The ledger," I murmured, my thoughts swirling. "This isn't just about the missing relic anymore, it's personal." Clara finally looked up at me, her face pale with terror. "I didn't do this, Mr. Holmes, I swear, I didn't kill him. Calm down," I interrupted, holstering my revolver. "I'm not accusing you, yet." My gaze never left Blackwood's body as I processed the scene. But someone is still pulling the strings, and they're always one step ahead. First the ledger, now this. It's no coincidence. I moved closer, my eyes scanning the room. Something about the way Blackwood's body was positioned, the marks on his skin, the unnatural angle of his neck, all of it felt orchestrated. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure this appeared as if it were a botched robbery or a random act of violence. But I knew better than that. This was no ordinary crime scene. It had been carefully constructed. A message, perhaps. "Clara, tell me exactly what happened," I said, turning to her once more. She was still shaking, her hands clutched tightly to her sides, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. "I don't know," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I heard a noise, something crashing, and I came in here to find him. He was lying on the floor already. I swear I didn't do it. I couldn't have. Did anyone else know about Blackwood's whereabouts?" I pressed, my mind spinning as I pieced together the connections. "Who else could have accessed this room besides you?" Clara looked panicked, her hands trembling. "Only Shaw. But I don't think he—" She faltered, eyes wide with realization, her voice cutting off abruptly. No, it can't be him. I don't want to believe it." I caught her hesitation and didn't let it slip by unnoticed. "You're saying Shaw knows something? Was he here when you found Blackwood?" Clara shook her head, backing away slightly. I didn't see him, but he was with me earlier in the library. I don't know. Maybe he did it. Maybe he's involved. But I don't know why." The confusion in her voice was genuine, but the unease in her eyes told a different story. She knew more than she was letting on. Perhaps not about the murder itself, but about something far more dangerous, something connecting Shaw to Blackwood's death. But it was too soon to draw any conclusions. I needed more answers, more evidence, to confirm my suspicions. As I turned back toward the body, I heard a faint rustling sound from the far corner of the room. I froze, my pulse quickening. There was someone else. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "Stay where you are," I ordered, moving swiftly toward the sound. But when I reached the corner, there was nothing but the empty air and the remains of a half-open cabinet. Whoever had been here was long gone. My mind raced. The killer had been here, in this very room, and now they were gone. They were always just beyond my reach, slipping through my fingers, leaving me in the dark. Blackwood's death was no longer the centerpiece of this investigation. It was a signal, a marker in a far more twisted game than I had ever imagined. The villain was still out there, and the stakes had never been higher. With every step I took toward the truth, I could feel the danger closing in, its shadows stretching, longer with each passing hour. I had no choice but to press forward, even as the threats grew more dangerous, and the deception more intricate, because I knew now, more than ever, that I had to solve this case, not just for justice, but to stop whatever was coming next. I could feel the weight of Clara's gaze on me, and for the first time since entering this house I hesitated. It wasn't the burden of solving the case that made my thoughts cloud. It was something much more personal. Clara, this woman I had initially dismissed as a mere victim, now stood at the center of a far more dangerous web than I could have imagined. She had hidden herself behind guilt and fear, trying to convince me she was simply caught in a game far beyond her control. But as I stared at the photograph on the mantel, the expression on her face, young, innocent, yet somehow tinged with an unsettling knowledge, spoke to me in a language beyond words. It was the past, I realized, the past that had shaped this entire tragedy. Clara, I began, my voice steady but laced with a quiet urgency. You keep saying you never wanted this, but your actions, the way you've protected EA, the way you've tried to shield the truth, it's clear now. You're not just a pawn in this game. You've been the architect of your own fate. Her eyes flashed, and I saw a flicker of something dark cross her face. Regret, fear, or something more. She took a deep breath, and for a brief moment, I thought she might confess everything, but instead she stepped back, her lips trembling. I didn't know what else to do, she whispered, the words coming out as if they were being torn from her throat. I thought I could protect him. I thought if I kept him safe, if I kept everything quiet, we could escape. Escape, I echoed, confusion mixing with my growing suspicion. Escape from what, Clara? She looked down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. From ourselves. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick with meaning. I couldn't quite grasp. I was about to press her further when the pieces suddenly clicked into place. The letter, the ledger, the web of deception. It wasn't just about money or power or revenge. It was about something more primal, something that had haunted Clara for years. Clara, I said slowly, carefully choosing my words. You weren't just protecting him. You were protecting yourself from the truth, from what you did all those years ago. Her head jerked up and her face paled. A look of horror passed through her features, followed by a resigned acceptance. It was then that I understood. The photograph, the letters, the actions that had seemed so puzzling before now made a horrible kind of sense. I wasn't just a victim, she whispered, the truth finally spilling from her like an open wound. I was part of it. I was the one who started it. EA wasn't the only one who wanted to escape, you know. I didn't just help him. I loved him. The words hit me like a thunderclap, and I took a step back, trying to process what she had just said. She loved him. EA, the manipulative figure who had orchestrated this entire thing, had also been the one to ensnare Clara in his dark web of lies. But there was more to it. Much more. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but there was no sign of remorse in them, only an overwhelming, unshakable weight of guilt. He told me it was all for us, that we could start over. He said that we could erase our past and live a life free from the mistakes we made. But she paused, her voice catching in her throat. But that wasn't what he wanted. He just wanted control. I could see it now, the dark psychological twist that had driven EA and Clara into this tangled nightmare. This wasn't just about money or power, not even about vengeance. It was about control over their past, their mistakes, and each other. Clara's role in this crime had never been about the ledger. It had always been about EA's grip on her, his ability to manipulate her into believing that together they could rewrite their history, bury their sins, and escape the consequences of their actions. But the truth was that EA had never intended to let her go. He needed her in this twisted game just as much as she needed him, even if she refused to see it. "What happened that night?" I asked, the question lingering between us. "What was it that you and Blackwood had done to bring this all to a head?" Clara shook her head, as if trying to fight off the flood of memories. It's not what you think. It wasn't just about the ledger. The ledger was a symbol, a bargaining chip. We had stolen it years ago, together. It was supposed to be our way out, our key to freedom. But when the authorities started looking for it, everything unraveled. That's why Blackwood was killed, I realized aloud. He had the ledger, and when it became clear it had value, someone needed to make sure it never saw the light of day. She nodded, but her face twisted with sorrow. But I didn't know that. I didn't know he would take it so far. He's always been manipulative. But this time, he killed to keep it all hidden. And when he saw me with you, he knew it was over. He thought I was going to betray him. And I almost did. But when you found the letter, when you started to uncover the truth, it all came rushing back. It was never about what I wanted. It was about what EA needed. The reality of her words sank deep into my mind. This was no ordinary case. EA had manipulated Clara so thoroughly that even in her fear and guilt, she had allowed herself to become a part of the very scheme that had ruined them both. She had been a willing participant in his twisted game, her love for him clouding her judgment until the very end. But what could I do with this knowledge? The case had taken a turn that even I hadn't anticipated. Blackwood had been the latest casualty in this war of control, but there would be others unless I could break the cycle. I turned away from Clara, my mind racing as I connected the dots. EA wasn't done. I had learned enough to know that he had planned his moves with precision. But now I could see the true scale of the game. EA wasn't just trying to erase their past, he was rewriting the future, and every move was part of a carefully orchestrated plan. I looked back at Clara, who was standing frozen in the corner, her tears having long since stopped. "Clara," I said softly, "I'm going to stop him. But you have to trust me now. The game isn't over yet, and EA will stop at nothing to get what he wants." For the first time since we had entered this house, she met my gaze, and in her eyes I saw something new, recognition, understanding. "I'll help you," she said quietly, and I knew then that she was no longer a pawn. She had taken the first step towards freeing herself from the man who had held her in his grasp for so long. Together, we would finish what had been started, but the path ahead was unclear. The real battle was about to begin. The night had fallen, and the streets of London were shrouded in a thick mist, as though the city itself was holding its breath. I paced back and forth in the dimly lit room, staring at the stack of papers and the cryptic ledger that had unraveled everything. Clara was standing by the window, her face pale, eyes distant. Her involvement, the years she had spent buried in a lie, still weighed heavily on her. But there was a new resolve in her posture. She had made her choice. She was no longer a victim of EA's machinations. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" I asked, my voice steady, but carrying the gravity of the moment. The final confrontation with EA was imminent, and everything hinged on this one pivotal moment. Clara didn't answer immediately. She turned from the window and looked at me, her eyes reflecting a mix of fear and determination. "I have to be. I've lived in his shadow for too long. This is the only way to end it." I nodded, acknowledging her strength, but I knew the path we were about to walk would demand far more from both of us. EA was cunning, meticulous. I had learned that much from our investigation. But now I had him cornered. The ledger, the letters, the photograph. Everything had led me to this final, fateful confrontation. The plan was simple enough, but like all good plans, it was reliant on EA's pride and overconfidence. He thought he was untouchable, that his carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation could withstand anything. He never saw it coming. The trap I had set for him. Clara had agreed to play her part, to lure him into a position where he would feel his victory was within reach. She would meet him tonight, in the abandoned warehouse near the docks where Blackwood had been found. It was the last place anyone would expect a confrontation, the last place where the authorities would dare look for him. EA would come to finish what he started, thinking he was out of reach, and that's when we would strike. I glanced at my watch, the seconds ticking away. The plan was in motion, and soon the trap would be sprung. "Remember," I said quietly, locking eyes with Clara, "you must act as if you're still with him. Don't show doubt. Don't let him think you're working with me. He won't hesitate if he suspects you've turned on him." Clara nodded, her lips tight. She understood the stakes. There could be no hesitation. As I left the room, I caught a final glimpse of her, a woman who had once been lost, now ready to take control of her own fate. We both knew that once this was over, nothing would ever be the same. Not for her, and certainly not for EA. I made my way to the warehouse, the air colder than it had been earlier, the fog thick enough to obscure my vision. I kept my steps light, my mind focused. Every detail I had gathered in the past weeks, the inconsistencies, the betrayals, the twisted motives, played out in my mind like the final pieces of a puzzle falling into place. When I arrived at the warehouse, I took a moment to survey the scene. It was quiet, save for the distant sound of water lapping against the docks. The silence felt oppressive, as though the world was waiting for the storm that was about to break. I took my position, in the shadows, knowing that EA would arrive soon. He was always punctual, always meticulous. He wouldn't risk showing up late, not when so much depended on this meeting. It wasn't long before I saw him, the figure emerging from the fog, his silhouette sharp against the mist. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed himself invincible, his steps measured, his mind already focused on the victory he thought he had secured. I waited, watching as he entered the warehouse. He didn't notice me at first, and I allowed him to walk further into the room, my heart pounding with anticipation. I could feel the tension in the air, the calm before the storm. The time had come. "Mr. E.A." I called, my voice cutting through, the silence like a blade. He froze, his back stiffening. For a moment I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Then the arrogance returned. He turned slowly, his lips curling into a smug smile. "Holmes," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "I must admit I'm impressed. You've managed to track me down, but you're too late. The game is over." "Is it?" I asked, my voice calm, steady. "You always think it's over, don't you? But you never learn. You never realize when you're caught in your own lies." E.A. took a step forward, his smile never faltering. "You've been chasing shadows, Holmes. You're too late to stop me." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I turned my gaze to the far corner of the warehouse, where Clara had entered quietly. She was positioned just as we had planned, standing in the shadows, waiting for the signal. It was crucial that E.A. didn't see her yet. He noticed the movement, his eyes darting in her direction. "What's this? Another one of your tricks, Holmes? You think you can intimidate me with her?" Clara stepped into the light, her face set with determination. There was no turning back now. "E.A.," she said, her voice steady. "It's over. You've lost." His eyes widened, the first crack in his composure. But it didn't last long. He regained his arrogance almost immediately, his lips curling into a sneer. "You've betrayed me, Clara. You were always weak. You were always a fool." But as he spoke, I noticed something. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, a twitch in his fingers. His hand was inching toward his coat pocket, where I knew he kept the small pistol that had been used to kill Blackwood. I had anticipated this move, and I was ready. Before he could draw it, I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the tension. "Don't even think about it." E.A. froze, his eyes narrowing. "You think you have me cornered, don't you? But you're wrong. I always knew this day would come. You're too late, Holmes." I took a step closer, my eyes locking with his. "No, E.A., you're the one who's too late." And in that moment, it all came together. The trap had been set perfectly, and now it was time to bring it to an end. I signaled to Clara, who moved swiftly, taking her place in front of the exit. She had done her part. Now it was my turn to finish what we had started. E.A. made a final, desperate attempt to reach for the gun, but he was too slow. With a single motion, I had him restrained, his arm twisted behind his back. The illusion of control, the false sense of invincibility, shattered in an instant. He struggled, but it was futile. The game was over. "You were always too arrogant," I said quietly, securing his wrists. "And now you'll face the consequences of your actions." The final piece had fallen into place. The case was solved and justice would be served. As I looked at Clara, her face a mixture of relief and regret, I knew that while the past could never be erased, the future was still hers to shape. As I stood there, watching E.A. struggle futilely against the restraints, something didn't sit right. I had him cornered. The case seemed solved, and yet the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at the back of my mind grew stronger. Clara's relief was palpable, but I could sense that something deeper, something hidden, was still at play. E.A. was muttering under his breath, his face twisted in anger. but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't uncovered the whole truth. The trap had worked, yes, but there had been moments throughout this investigation, small, seemingly inconsequential details, that now began to make more sense, in a way that unsettled me. Clara noticed my hesitation and stepped forward, concern etching her features. "Sherlock, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with the same tension I felt. "We've caught him. It's over." But I couldn't bring myself to agree. "Is it?" I muttered more to myself than to her. EA let out a dry laugh, as though he had caught on to the subtle shift in the air. "What's wrong, Holmes? Suddenly doubting your own brilliance? It's too late for second guesses." I ignored him, my mind racing through the events of the past few days. The meticulous planning, the false clues, the moments of strange coincidence. There had been too many misdirections, too many lucky breaks for EA to have been the mastermind. Could it have all been orchestrated from the beginning? I needed to look at everything again from a different angle. Suddenly it hit me, the missing puzzle piece. Something so simple yet so crucial had slipped past me. The photograph. The one of EA and Blackwood together looking perfectly innocent. It had seemed like just another piece of evidence pointing to a partnership turned sour, but I had overlooked the true meaning of the image. It wasn't just a photograph, it was a message. My eyes widened, and I turned quickly to Clara. "Clara, the photograph. It's not EA we should be focusing on. It's someone else. Someone you've been protecting." Clara froze, her eyes flickering with confusion and fear. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, but there was a subtle shift in her voice, a crack in her composure. I took a step closer, lowering my voice to match hers. "You didn't tell me everything, Clara. You hid something. You've known this all along, haven't you?" Her lips trembled, and I could see the guilt in her eyes before she even spoke. I didn't have a choice," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. EA wasn't the mastermind. He was just a pawn, a distraction." I felt the air leave my lungs. A pawn. For whom? The realization came in a rush. There had been someone else pulling the strings from the shadows. Someone we hadn't considered. "You're talking about your brother, aren't you?" I asked, almost dreading the answer. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't deny it. "My brother James. He was the one who set everything in motion. EA was supposed to be a part of it all, but when things started spiraling, he lost control. He wasn't meant to be. The final piece of the puzzle. James always wanted to be the one in charge. He wanted the power, the influence, the money, and he knew how to get it." My mind raced. James, Clara's brother, had been a name I had dismissed early on, assuming he was merely a background figure. But now everything clicked into place. James had used Clara, manipulated her into playing a role, all while remaining unseen in the background. He had orchestrated the whole thing using EA as a distraction, a tool to mislead me. It had been James who planted the false leads, who made sure the investigation veered off course at just the right moments. "Where is he now?" I asked, my voice tightening with the pressure of everything suddenly becoming clear. Clara bit her lip, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "He's gone, Sherlock. He's been planning this for years. He knew everything about me, about you, about all of us. He'll be far away by now and you'll never find him. I shook my head, a new surge of determination rising within me. You're wrong. I will find him. This isn't over. At that moment, a door creaked open behind us, and I spun around, already alert. The trap was still set. EA was restrained. Clara was safe. But the true enemy had slipped through our fingers, and now he was making his move. A figure stepped into the dim light, and my heart skipped a beat. It was James. His face was calm, too calm, and his expression was the one of a man who had already won. "You really thought you could stop me, Sherlock," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "You think this is just about money, power, revenge? You're a fool." "James," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "How could you do this?" He ignored her, his gaze locked onto mine. "You never understood the game, Holmes. This isn't just a crime, not just a series of murders. It's a revolution, a new world, one where I control everything." I didn't move, didn't react. I was already several steps ahead. "You made a mistake, James, underestimating me, and now it's over." But I wasn't sure anymore. As he stepped closer, I realized that he wasn't here to gloat, to tie up loose ends. He had one final trick up his sleeve, one last, desperate move that would shake everything I thought I knew. I could hear the faint click of metal behind me, the sound of a door closing softly, a trap within a trap. And then, in the darkened corner of the room, I saw the glint of steel. The last piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place, and this time it wasn't going to be solved with logic, it was going to be solved with action. The room fell into a taut silence as James's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a man who thought he had already won. The glint of steel I'd seen earlier, a hidden weapon, was now clear. A gun, tucked under his coat, its barrel aimed at me with the precision of a man who had rehearsed the moment. Clara stepped back, her face pale, realizing the gravity of the situation. Her brother, the mastermind behind the entire web of deception, now had us both cornered. "You think you've outsmarted me, Sherlock, but this is the final act," James said, his voice low but confident. "You never understood the bigger picture. It wasn't just about the murder or the money, it was about control. And now, you've walked right into my trap." I kept my focus on him, not letting my gaze waver for a second. Every instinct told me that I was in imminent danger, but I wasn't about to let him dictate the terms of this final confrontation. I needed to understand his psychology, to see the cracks in his plan, before it was too late. "You're right about one thing, James," I said, my voice steady. "You've been playing the game better than anyone, but you've made one fatal mistake. You underestimated me, and you underestimated Clara." James's lips twisted into a smile, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that didn't match the smugness of his grin. "Clara? She's a mere pawn, always was. You think she could have stopped me? No. She was the perfect distraction, the perfect way to keep you looking in the wrong direction." I shook my head slowly, my thoughts crystal clear now. "No, James. You've been using Clara to hide behind, but your real mistake wasn't her. Your mistake was thinking you could control me, or control this entire investigation." He faltered for a moment, the smile slipping as he searched my face for any sign of doubt. But I wasn't finished. The missing evidence, the strange inconsistencies in the case. It wasn't all by chance, was it? You made sure we followed the wrong leads, that we missed the true connection between you and your accomplice. But there's something you didn't account for. Something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Your ego. You wanted to be the one pulling the strings. The one everyone thought was the mastermind. His jaw clenched, and the hand that had been steady on the gun trembled ever so slightly. You wanted to be the center of attention, I continued, and that's why you made your presence known, leaving clues that pointed straight to you. But the real crime was what you didn't want us to find, the fact that someone else has been helping you, someone even closer to you than EA. The photograph of you and Blackwood wasn't just a picture of two criminals. It was a warning. It was about legacy, about family. I could see the realization dawn on James, but his expression was still cold. You don't know what you're talking about. This is bigger than you think, Sherlock. I pressed on, ignoring the tension in the room. Your plan, James, was never just about taking money or power. It was about creating a system, a framework where you could rule without question. You knew the game, you knew the players, and you knew that in the end, everyone would come for you. But you also knew the secret. Clara is your weakness. She's the one thing you couldn't control. Clara's eyes widened at my words, her emotions a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. You used me, she whispered, her voice cracking. James flinched, but only for a second. He adjusted his stance, his cold composure returning. It was necessary, he said flatly. You were always the means to an end, Clara. But not anymore, I said, my voice rising slightly. I see through you now, and you've made a grave error in underestimating your sister's strength. With a sudden movement, I dove to the side, using the element of surprise to knock over a nearby chair. It hit the ground with a loud crash, momentarily distracting James and giving me the fraction of a second I needed. He reacted too slowly, and I was already moving, sliding across the floor to close the distance between us. In one fluid motion, I grabbed the barrel of the gun, twisting it sharply as James struggled. The weapon fell to the ground out of his grasp. You're finished, I said, my voice icy with the finality of the moment. I looked toward Clara, who was still frozen, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. You don't have to protect him anymore. James, now disarmed, fell to his knees, his expression crumbling as he realized that all his meticulous planning, all his manipulation, had unraveled in an instant. For a brief moment I could see genuine fear in his eyes, a fear I had not expected from a man so seemingly confident and in control. It's over, James, I said quietly, kneeling down to meet his gaze. You're going to pay for what you've done. And your carefully constructed world of lies, it's falling apart right now. Clara took a tentative step forward, her breath coming in short, anxious gasps. Sherlock, she said, her voice trembling. What happens now? I stood up and nodded, turning to face her. Now, we make sure the truth comes out, Clara. James may have thought he was playing a game, but he's about to lose. You won't have to hide behind his schemes anymore. The police arrived soon after, having been alerted by the trap I had set in motion hours ago. But as they took James into custody, something gnawed at me, a feeling that we had still missed something, that we hadn't fully closed the door on this case yet. The investigation had revealed more than I had anticipated, but it had also raised new questions. Who had been helping James all along? Who was pulling the strings in the shadows, watching and waiting? I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. As the door to the interrogation room closed behind James, I realized the unsettling truth. While justice had been served today, a far greater mystery had just begun. As the final police cars drove away, their sirens fading into the distance, I stood there in the quiet of the courtyard, my thoughts swirling. The case was closed, or so it seemed. James was in custody. The tangled web of lies had been unraveled, and Clara was free from his manipulation. Yet, as I stared at the empty street where the last officer had disappeared, a weight pressed heavily on my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still not right. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, but there was something I had missed. Something too subtle to be caught in the frenzy of the final confrontation. The way James had looked at me when he thought I was closing in. It hadn't been the fear of a man who had lost control, but something more, a knowing, as if he had expected it all along. A flicker of recognition passed through me, but it was gone before I could place it. Clara approached, her footsteps hesitant but steady. She had been through so much, and yet there was still an unsettling emptiness in her eyes. "Sherlock," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the stillness. "What happens now?" I turned to her, offering a faint smile, but inside I was far from settled. "Now," I said, my words slow as I thought through them, "you begin to rebuild. James may have thought he controlled everything, but you have a choice now. You can live without the weight of his influence." She nodded, but I could see the confusion still clinging to her. She wasn't truly free yet. Her mind was still tangled in the knots her brother had tied. It would take time, I knew, to undo the damage he had done. But Clara was stronger than she realized, and the truth, though painful, would be her path forward. "I suppose that's the most I can ask for," she whispered. I offered her a reassuring nod, but even as I spoke, my mind was still racing. There was something more I hadn't said, something that was gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. "We'll talk more soon," I said, offering her a final glance before turning back toward the palace gates. But before I could take another step, I felt a familiar presence. My heart quickened slightly. John had caught up with me. "Holmes," he said, his voice filled with a quiet urgency that mirrored my own thoughts. "Are you sure it's over?" I glanced at him, my eyes narrowing slightly as I took in his expression. "What do you mean?" John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed me a small folded piece of paper, the edges worn and creased as if it had been handled countless times. My eyes skimmed over it, and as I read the cryptic message, a cold shiver ran down my spine. It was written in plain text, but the words themselves were anything but ordinary. "The game has only just begun." The message was brief, yet somehow it felt more like a warning than a statement. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, and the ink had dried in a way that suggested it had been penned only moments before it was passed to John. I felt my pulse quicken, the adrenaline from the earlier events surging through me again. "Who gave you this?" I asked, my voice suddenly tight with suspicion. John hesitated, his brow furrowing. "A woman dressed in black. She just handed it to me as we were leaving. She said it was for you." A woman in black. The description sent a chill through me, the figure vague yet immediately evocative. I turned the note over in my hands, searching for any other marks, any clues that might indicate its origin. But there was nothing. No signature, no symbol, just those unsettling words. A slow smile tugged at the corners of my mouth, but it was a smile tinged with something darker. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. "Holmes?" John asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. I folded the paper back up and placed it into my pocket. "This game, it's far from finished. There's someone else out there, John. Someone who's been watching, waiting. James was just a piece of the puzzle. Whoever left this note knows something I don't yet understand, and they're playing us all, pulling strings in ways we haven't even begun to see." John shook his head, a mix of disbelief and concern on his face. "Another case? After everything we've been through?" I met his gaze, my mind already racing ahead, sifting through every detail I had learned, every connection I had made. "Yes. Another case, and this time we won't be caught off guard." As we walked back toward Baker Street, I couldn't help but wonder how many more players were hidden in the shadows, how many more pieces were yet to be revealed. The world of crime, of secrets and lies was far from simple, and in every case I solved, a deeper mystery lurked just out of reach. The streets of London were quiet now, but I knew that wouldn't last. There was always another puzzle to solve, another mind to outwit, and another game to play. And as long as I was walking the streets, there would be no shortage of mysteries to uncover. So while justice had been served in this particular case, I knew I hadn't seen the end. No, this was merely the beginning. The game had changed, and now we were playing by new rules, and I was ready.